In the long and shadowed corridors of history, there are moments when even the most powerful leaders realize the tides have turned against them. For Emperor Hirohito of Japan, the man whose divine presence was both the spiritual center and political symbol of his nation, that moment was recorded not in speeches, not in proclamations, but in the private, fragile lines of his own diary. Hidden for decades, these writings reveal a side of Hirohito rarely glimpsed, not the untouchable god-emperor, but a human being, burdened by the weight of empire and haunted by the realization that the world he had known was crumbling around him. As the Pacific burned and Japan's once invincible forces were driven back across the ocean, Hirohito's diary captured the slow unraveling of a dream and the dawning recognition that Japan was not destined for eternal victory, but for inevitable defeat. These words, stark, restrained yet piercing, echo with the silent desperation of a man who could no longer ignore the truth. In them, we see the clash between belief and reality, pride and collapse, divinity and mortality. This is not just the story of a nation at war. It is the story of one man standing at the crossroads of history, staring into the abyss of his own undoing and realizing that Japan was doomed. Tonight, we open those pages and step into his world. The diary begins not with dramatic proclamations, but with the quiet cadence of a man who had long been shielded from the brutal realities of the world. Hirohito had lived his life as something between a monarch and a myth, a figure shrouded in ritual, elevated above the struggles of ordinary men. His words weighed as divine utterances, yet by 1944, the protective veil of ceremony was thinning. Japan's war machine, once unstoppable, had begun to falter against the relentless momentum of the Allied advance. In the diary, Hirohito's voice trembles between detached observation and concealed dread, as if writing the words themselves was a rebellion against the illusion of invincibility that surrounded him. He notes the mounting losses in the Pacific, the fall of Saipan, the devastating air raids that scorched Japanese cities, the tightening grip of an enemy that seemed to possess endless resources. These entries are restrained, almost clinical, but beneath the ink lies the shadow of realization. The empire he commanded, the empire built on decades of expansion and sacrifice, was beginning to collapse under its own weight. What makes these words striking is not merely the facts they record, but the silence they break. For generations, emperors had existed above the noise of politics, insulated from accountability, presented as figures of destiny rather than men of doubt. Hirohito's diary, however, betrays the faint cracks in that facade. He confesses an unease about the strategies of his generals, a growing awareness that the promises whispered to him of final victory, of divine favor, were little more than desperate illusions. The diary paints a portrait of a man caught between two selves, the emperor who must maintain divine composure for the sake of his people, and the human who cannot ignore the flames rising across his empire. He describes sleepless nights, moments of staring out into the palace gardens, listening not to the words of his ministers, but to the distant thunder of bombs falling on Tokyo. In those silences, his pen captured truths his lips could not dare speak aloud. It is important to understand the cultural prison in which Hirohito found himself. He was never simply a man. He was Tenno, the heavenly sovereign, the embodiment of Japan itself. To admit weakness, even privately, was to fracture the myth of divinity that had sustained the empire. Yet as the war drew closer to Japan's shores, even myths struggled to survive reality. The diary's language shifts in tone, from the confidence of earlier years to a hesitant, almost pleading rhythm. He records reports of American advances with words that lack the triumphant grandeur once common in Japanese rhetoric. Instead, there is resignation. He writes of Saipan's fall as a grave misfortune, a phrase that in Japanese imperial diction masked an unspoken catastrophe. For Hirohito, Saipan was not merely a loss of territory, it was the first direct crack in the armor, the moment. He recognized that Japan's defenses could not hold indefinitely. From Saipan, the path to Japan's heartland lay open, and Hirohito knew it. His diary lingers on this, almost as if repeating the words could soften the blow. As the months pass, the entries deepen in despair. Reports of air raids fill his pages. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, all burned beneath the relentless weight of Allied firebombing. Hirohito records them not in the fiery adjectives of war propaganda, but in a muted tone that suggests numbness. He describes the devastation as if struggling to reconcile it with his belief in Japan's resilience. Yet in the quiet corners of his words, one can almost hear the emperor's heart faltering. He notes the rising starvation among civilians, the exhaustion of soldiers, the hollow eyes of children evacuated to the countryside. The divine aura that once separated him from his people begins to fade in his writing. In its place emerges a shared suffering, a recognition that even he, the emperor, could not shield his nation from the tides of war. It is in these passages that the most haunting realization emerges. Hirohito had begun to see defeat, not as a possibility, but as inevitability. He does not announce it. He never allows the word defeat to stain his pages. Instead, he writes in metaphors of storms, of tides, of shadows growing longer with each passing day. He compares Japan's struggle to a tree battered by relentless winds, still standing, but stripped of leaves, its trunk cracking under invisible strain. In this imagery lies the truth he dared not name. Japan was doomed, and no divine mandate could reverse that fate. His diary is not a confession to the world, but a whisper to himself, a quiet acknowledgement of mortality, his own and that of the empire. For modern readers, the power of these diary entries lies not in their revelation of military details, but in their human vulnerability. Hirohito, often remembered as a distant and enigmatic figure, emerges as a man cornered by history. He was not a general commanding armies, nor a politician navigating strategies, but a symbol forced to carry the unbearable weight of inevitability. His diary captures the moment when myth met mortality, when the emperor ceased to be a god in his own eyes and became a man staring into the abyss of defeat. These pages remind us that even those cloaked in divinity cannot escape the truth of history. No empire lasts forever, and no leader, however powerful, can deny the turning of the tide. By 1945, Hirohito's diary begins to take on the tone of a man who feels the walls closing in. The entries no longer read like distant reflections, but like fragments of thought, as though the emperor's hand trembled while trying to capture the enormity of the catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. He describes the bombing of Tokyo not only in terms of destruction, but in terms of sound, the constant thunder of engines above, the shrill cries of children pulled from the rubble, the heavy silence that followed when entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. For an emperor whose palace had always been a sanctuary of serenity, surrounded by still ponds and immaculately pruned gardens, the diary reveals how even the heart of his world quaked under fire. The imperial compound itself was shaken by explosions, and Hirohito, once untouchable, wrote of walking the grounds after a raid, seeing shattered glass and scorched wood where imperial walls had once stood unbroken. In that silence, he felt what millions of his subjects had long endured: vulnerability, helplessness, and the fragility of life in a war that devoured everything in its path. The diary also exposes Hirohito's complex relationship with his military advisors during this period. To the outside world, he was expected to project unity with his generals, to embody the unwavering spirit of a divine nation. But in his private writing, doubts bled through. He mentions conferences in which his commanders spoke confidently of decisive battles that would turn the tide, yet Hirohito's entries suggest he no longer believed them. He records their words with formality, almost as if fulfilling a duty to write them down. But his silence afterward speaks volumes. He questions their optimism subtly, noting instead the exhaustion of the troops, the dwindling supplies of oil, the daily sacrifices demanded of civilians who had already given everything. What emerges is the image of an emperor trapped between loyalty to his generals and loyalty to truth. The men surrounding him continued to speak of honor, sacrifice, and glorious resistance. But in the diary, Hirohito allows himself to admit what they could not. The war was unwinnable. One of the most poignant elements in these entries is his growing concern for his people. For much of the early war, Hirohito's diary had centered on reports, strategies, and symbolic reflections. But by 1945, the suffering of ordinary Japanese citizens begins to dominate his pages. He writes of evacuees flooding the countryside, their possessions carried in small bundles, their faces marked with both exhaustion and resignation. He mentions mothers begging for rice to feed their children, children writing letters to fathers who would never return from the front, and entire villages reduced to ashes in the span of a single night. The emperor, who had once been shielded from the realities of civilian life, was now haunted by it. His words betray a heavy awareness. It was not only the empire that was crumbling, but the very fabric of daily life, the rhythm of existence for millions who had once believed in his divinity. These entries reveal Hirohito's quiet torment, the recognition that the war he had sanctioned, however indirectly, had brought unimaginable suffering to the very people he was sworn to protect. Perhaps the most haunting moment in these writings comes when Hirohito reflects on Okinawa. The battle there was more than a military campaign. It was a forewarning of what awaited Japan itself. In his diary, Hirohito records the reports of carnage with subdued horror. The sheer scale of death, both military and civilian, shocked him. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians were caught in the crossfire, and his pages hint at his inner turmoil as he acknowledges the unspeakable human cost. He writes of Okinawa not in the language of victory or even defeat, but as a tragedy, a dark mirror held up to Japan's own future should the Americans set foot on the home islands. His words are sparse, as if brevity could shield him from despair, but they carry the unmistakable weight of foreboding. Through Okinawa, Hirohito glimpsed what total war on Japanese soil would look like, and it terrified him. It is within this fear that the diary becomes more than a record. It becomes a confession. Hirohito never directly states that Japan was doomed, but his entries betray the realization through metaphor and silence. He writes of the emperor's role as a lantern in the storm, yet admits the flame flickers dangerously low. He describes Japan as a vessel cracked by waves, barely afloat, and wonders if the gods had turned their gaze elsewhere. These are not the words of a ruler clinging to illusions. They are the words of a man acknowledging a storm that no willpower, no divinity could withstand. His diary shows us the emperor as human, standing at the precipice of collapse, powerless to turn back the tide. And yet, even as he wrote these lines, Hirohito remained bound by duty and myth. To admit defeat publicly was unthinkable. To question the war openly was impossible. Thus, his diary became his only refuge, the only place where he could confront reality without shattering the illusion that sustained the empire. Reading these entries today, we are struck by their duality. The emperor as both symbol and man, both divine and desperately mortal. The words reveal a leader who had been taught his entire life that his will was destiny, now forced to face the unbearable truth that history had slipped beyond his grasp. It is in this paradox that we discover the true power of Hirohito's diary, not in its details of battles lost or bombs dropped, but in its glimpse of a man wrestling with inevitability, a man who had realized that Japan's story of victory had already ended, long before the final surrender was spoken aloud. By the summer of 1945, Hirohito's diary transforms from a chronicle of dread into a testimony of inevitability. The emperor who once wrote in metaphor now finds himself facing realities so stark that no allegory could soften them. His entries, from July and August, read like fragments of a man pressed into silence by the enormity of what was happening. The American advance had already crushed Japan's last defenses, but it was the sudden arrival of a weapon unlike any the world had ever seen that shattered even the faintest illusions of hope. The diary describes the reports of Hiroshima in tones stripped of ceremony. There is no grandeur, no martial language, only an almost clinical recording of devastation, a city reduced to ashes in an instant, tens of thousands gone before the emperor could even breathe the words aloud. In one line, Hirohito notes the blinding light and searing heat, not as a scientist, but as a man struggling to comprehend how a single weapon could annihilate what once seemed indestructible. Days later, when Nagasaki met the same fate, his writing betrays the despair of someone who had realized that Japan's time had expired. The war was no longer about strategy, nor about honor. It was about survival. In these final entries before the surrender, Hirohito's pen reveals a man torn between two unbearable choices: to continue a hopeless war and watch his people perish, or to surrender and break the sacred myth of imperial divinity. His generals demanded resistance, urging him to fight to the last man, to sacrifice every blade of grass if necessary. Yet his diary exposes the emperor's quiet refusal to let such madness dictate the fate of Japan. He writes of sleepless nights, of pacing the palace halls while the distant hum of American bombers circled overhead, of envisioning the faces of starving children who would never know peace if the war dragged on. In these moments, Hirohito's diary ceases to be merely a private record. It becomes the crucible where he transforms from figurehead into decision-maker. For the first time, he places the survival of his people above the preservation of myth. The weight of centuries bore down on his shoulders, and in those pages we see the lonely courage of a man prepared to shatter tradition for the sake of humanity. The entry surrounding the imperial rescript on surrender, though brief, is perhaps the most haunting. He does not write in triumphant prose nor in humiliating confession, but in the weary tone of one who has seen too much. He describes the act not as victory or defeat, but as the end of unbearable suffering. For Hirohito, surrender was not betrayal, it was salvation. In the diary, he reflects on the role of the emperor as the father of the people and admits that a father cannot watch his children burn in vain. These words, though simple, pierce through decades of constructed divinity, reminding us that at the heart of every empire is a human soul capable of grief, regret, and compassion. His diary reveals that the emperor did not surrender to the Allies alone. He surrendered to truth, to history, to the inescapable reality that no god, no nation, no myth could defy the power of time and consequence. Reading these final entries, today, one cannot help but feel the heavy silence between his words. The diary does not rage, it does not cry out, it simply acknowledges. It acknowledges the limits of power, the fragility of nations, and the humanity that lingers even in those cast as divine. Hirohito's surrender was not just Japan's surrender, it was the surrender of myth to mortality, of illusion to reality. His diary is more than a historical artifact. It is a mirror held up to all leaders, all nations, all people who believe themselves untouchable. Empires may rise with the certainty of gods, but they fall with the silence of men who realize too late that history bends to no one. And so, in the ink of Hirohito's hand, we find not only the story of Japan's defeat, but the story of humanity itself, fragile, proud, and humbled before the weight of time.